Rain drizzled over the empty parking lot, the cold pavement glistening under the red glow of the hospital's emergency sign. A lone figure sat unmoving near the entrance. A German shepherd, his eyes locked on the glass doors. 7 days. Through rain and cold, he had waited. Nurses came and went, patients were wheeled out, but the dog never left. His body was tense, ears flicking at every sound, eyes scanning every person who stepped through those doors. He wasn't just waiting, he was searching. A nurse crouched down, offering him a piece of bread. "Come on, boy, you must be hungry." The dog didn't move, didn't even glance at the food. His gaze remained fixed on the entrance, the doors sliding open and closed with a soft hiss. Inside, the steady beep, beep, beep of a heart monitor echoed through the dimly lit hospital room. The bed was occupied by an aging man, his face weathered from years of duty. His breaths were slow, shallow, each one a battle. A thin oxygen tube rested beneath his nose, hissing softly as it fed him air. His fingers twitched slightly, as if reaching for something or someone. His lips parted, voice barely a whisper. "Rex." Outside, the dog's ears pricked, his head lifted, muscles tensing. A whine slipped from his throat. He took a step forward, then stopped, his nails clicking against the wet pavement. Young officer stepped out of the hospital, his uniform crisp, his expression solemn. He knelt beside the dog, running a hand gently over his damp fur. "Come on, Rex, you've been out here for days. Let's get you somewhere warm." Rex didn't move. His paws remained planted, eyes locked on the hospital doors. The officer sighed, defeated. "Suit yourself, buddy." He gave the dog one last pat before heading back inside. The doors swished closed. Rex didn't flinch. The sun burned hot against the Arizona sky, its golden light bouncing off the gravel as boots crunched against the ground. Officer John Matthews walked past rows of kennels, sharp blue eyes scanning the dogs inside. Barking filled the air, each dog eager for attention, each one except one. He stopped. The German shepherd sat at perfect attention, not barking, not pacing, just watching, studying this one. The trainer beside him said, "He's smart, fast, loyal, but he's got a bit of a stubborn streak." John crouched, meeting the dog's intense gaze. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he murmured. "So do I." The dog tilted his head slightly. John reached into his pocket, pulling out a small rubber ball. He rolled it toward the kennel's bars. The shepherd's ears twitched. He stared at the ball for a long moment, unmoving. Then, slowly, he nudged it back with his nose. John's smirk grew into a full grin. "That's my boy." Months passed, early mornings, late nights, endless training. At first, the dog refused to obey certain commands, stubbornly staring at John as if questioning his authority. But John was patient. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration. He worked, he adapted. And so did Rex. The bond formed quickly. Where John went, Rex followed. Whether on duty or off, they were a unit. First assignment: drug bust in a rundown warehouse. The place reeked of mildew and rotting wood. Rex moved through the crates, nose twitching before stopping abruptly, his body rigid. John crouched beside him. "You got something, boy?" Rex let out a short, sharp bark, his tail stiff. A few minutes later, the crate was pried open, millions in narcotics seized. Weeks passed. Patrols became routine, long drives in the squad. Car with Rex beside him, ears flicking at every passing noise. The low hum of the police radio filled the silence between them. Another night, another call. A suspect fleeing down an alleyway, dark and narrow. Rex bolted ahead, muscles rippling as he tackled the man to the ground before he could disappear into the shadows. It wasn't just work, it was trust. At home, John tossed the same rubber ball across the living room. Rex caught it mid-air, tail wagging. The house, once empty and quiet, now felt full. A canine partner isn't just a dog, John would say. He's family. The night it happened, the air was thick with tension. Sirens wailed, red and blue lights flashing against the damp walls of a narrow alleyway. Shots rang out. John hit the pavement, his breath leaving him in a sharp gasp. Pain exploded in his side, blood soaked through his uniform. "Officer down! Officer down!" Rex stood over him, teeth bared, growling at the shadowy figure in front of them. The suspect raised his gun again. Rex lunged. A struggle, a scream. The sound of a body hitting the ground. And then, silence. John's vision blurred, his fingers weakly curled into Rex's fur. The last thing he saw before the darkness took over was the dog's wide, desperate eyes staring down at him. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and something faintly metallic. Machines beeped rhythmically. John's body was weak, heavier. Then he remembered. He turned his head slowly, searching. Rex. But the chair beside his bed was empty. His chest tightened. A nurse approached, adjusting his IV. "My dog," he rasped. "Where is he?" The nurse hesitated. "The department took him. They said, with your condition, he needed to be reassigned." John felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs. Reassigned. His fingers clenched into a fist. Rex was gone. 7 days later, the hospital doors slid open once again. A wheelchair rolled forward, pushed by a nurse. John's body was frail, but his eyes were searching, scanning. Then he saw him, Rex, still sitting by the entrance, still waiting. John's throat tightened. "Rex!" The dog lifted his head, but he didn't move, didn't run to him, didn't wag his tail. His eyes, once filled with life, were distant. Something was wrong. John's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't the Rex he knew. The dog, sitting before him, was still, unblinking, his body tense but hollow. No recognition sparked in his deep brown eyes. "Rex!" John called again, voice rough, hopeful. His fingers gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, as if willing himself to stand. The German Shepherd didn't move. John felt his heart tighten. He had imagined this moment differently. He had thought Rex would rush to him, tail wagging, ears pinned back in excitement, but the dog remained frozen, his gaze flickering for only a second before turning away. The young officer from before stood nearby, watching with an unreadable expression. He cleared his throat. "He's different now." John's head snapped toward him. "What do you mean?" The officer sighed, crouching down beside Rex, running a careful hand over his fur. After the night of the shooting, he refused food. For days. Wouldn't respond to anyone, wouldn't follow commands. The trainers tried everything, but it was like he shut down. They thought maybe reassignment would help. New handler, new start. John felt an ache deep in his chest. "You reassigned him?" The officer hesitated before nodding. "He's been with another unit, but he's never been the same. When he ran off and showed up here, we didn't know what to do. We tried to take him back, but..." John swallowed hard. Rex had waited for him. He had returned to the last place where they had been together, but now, sitting just feet away, he was a stranger. "Can I see him alone?" John asked. The officer nodded, stepping back. The nurse pushed John's wheelchair closer before retreating inside, leaving them. In the cold silence of the hospital entrance, John leaned forward, his voice softer now. "Rex, it's me, buddy." The dog's ears twitched at the familiar tone, but there was no other reaction. John reached into his pocket, his fingers wrapping around something small and worn. His old rubber ball. He held it up, rolling it between his fingers like he had done so many times before. Rex's gaze flickered downward. A pause, a hesitation, then nothing. John exhaled slowly. He had faced criminals, taken bullets, endured the hardest days of his life. But this was worse. The one soul he had trusted more than anything in the world was right in front of him. And yet, He was gone. His throat tightened. "I never left you, Rex. I didn't choose this." His voice wavered. "I would have come back if for you." The dog shifted slightly, his muscles rippling under his thick coat. His ears twitched again, but his posture remained guarded. John could feel it slipping away, the bond they had built, the trust that once felt unbreakable. He gritted, his teeth gripping the rubber ball in his palm. He wasn't giving up. Not yet. He tossed the ball. It rolled across the pavement, stopping inches from Rex's paws. The dog looked down at it, his body tense. John held his breath, but Rex didn't move, didn't touch it, didn't push it back. For the first time in his life, John Matthews felt truly, devastatingly alone. John sat in silence, staring at Rex as the weight of reality pressed down on him. The dog, who had once been his shadow, his partner, his family, now sat mere feet away, but it felt like an impossible distance. A sharp gust of wind cut through the night air, rattling the hospital's metal railing. Rex blinked, but didn't flinch. His posture remained stiff, almost mechanical, as if some invisible barrier separated him from the world. John clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to let this be the end. "I know you remember, buddy," he murmured. "I know you're in there." Rex's tail gave the faintest twitch, a movement so small that anyone else would have missed it. But John saw it. A flicker of something, recognition, doubt, maybe even longing. He took a slow breath, forcing the desperation from his voice. "You saved my life that night." His fingers traced the scar hidden beneath his hospital gown, the reminder of the bullet that nearly ended everything. "And I know that cost you something. I know it changed you, but I'm still here." Rex's ears flicked back slightly, but his gaze remained distant. John swallowed the lump in his throat. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Trust was delicate, and something had broken inside Rex. The only way to rebuild it was patience. The young officer, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward hesitantly. "You can't force him to remember, sir." John's grip tightened on the wheelchair armrest. "I'm not forcing anything," he muttered. Then softer, "I'm reminding him." A long silence stretched between them before the officer finally sighed. "You need rest. You're still recovering." John exhaled sharply. He knew they wouldn't let him stay out here all night, but he also knew he wasn't leaving without Rex. "Let me take him home." The officer hesitated. "Sir, I don't think I trained him. I know him better than anyone." John's voice was firm. "If there's a chance to bring him back, it's with me." The officer looked at Rex, who hadn't moved, then back at John. Finally, with a reluctant nod, he said, "I'll clear it with the department." The car ride home was quiet. Rex sat in the back seat, staring blankly out the window, his reflection caught in the dim glow of passing streetlights. John stole glances at him through the rearview mirror. In the past, a simple car ride was enough to send Rex into a flurry of excitement, his tail wagging, nose pressed to the glass, ears flicking at every passing sound. Now, he was still, silent. John tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had seen dogs suffer trauma before. Canines who had lost handlers, been injured in the field, left abandoned or rehomed. But Rex wasn't just any dog. He was John's partner, and losing him like this was worse than death. The house felt colder than John remembered. Maybe it was the weeks of being away, or maybe it was the emptiness Rex carried with him. John moved carefully, still weak from the hospital, but he didn't rest. He set down a fresh bowl of water, pulled out Rex's old bed from the closet, and retrieved the box of toys he had tucked away after the shooting. Rex stood by the doorway, his body rigid, his eyes scanning the space like a stranger in an unfamiliar place. John crouched down, holding out the rubber ball again. "Remember this?" His voice was hopeful but not pleading. "First thing you ever played with?" Rex's gaze flickered toward it but quickly shifted away. John tried again, reaching into the box. He pulled out an old, worn-down police vest. "This is yours." He placed it on the floor, patting the fabric. Rex's nose twitched slightly. A muscle in his jaw tightened. John barely breathed. For a moment, just a split second, something passed over Rex's face, an emotion too fleeting to name. But just as quickly, he turned away and padded to the corner of the room, curling into himself. John exhaled, rubbing his hands down his face. This was going to be harder than he thought. Days passed. Small attempts, small failures. John tried everything. Old commands. Rex didn't respond. Familiar routes around the neighborhood. Rex walked beside him, but kept his head low, his body tense. John even played old recordings from their police radio, hoping the familiar sounds would spark something. Nothing. It was like looking at a ghost. John sat on the porch one evening, staring at the dog curled up at his feet. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the scars on his arm, the ones that hadn't been there before the shooting. "I used to think nothing could break you," he whispered. "I guess I was wrong." Rex let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. John's eyes burned. He wasn't giving up, but God, it hurt. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. John had been in the kitchen washing dishes when a crash echoed from the living room. His heart jumped. He turned, sharply, pain shooting through his side from the sudden movement. Rex stood stiffly, his tail tucked, ears pinned back. A picture frame had fallen from the shelf, glass shattered across the floor. John's eyes flickered to the photograph inside the frame, an old picture of them taken on their first official day as partners. Rex's gaze was locked onto it, his breathing shallow. John moved carefully, kneeling down despite the pain. "Hey," he murmured. "It's okay." Rex didn't move, but his muscles twitched as if he were restraining himself. John picked up the photograph, brushing off the shards of glass. "You remember this day?" His voice was soft, steady. "You wouldn't sit still, kept trying to chase the pigeons in the parking lot." Rex blinked. His ears twitched forward just a little. Encouraged, John continued. "And I said if you got through the training without tackling anyone, I'd give you a steak dinner." He chuckled lightly. "You damn near tackled me when I brought it home." A pause. Then, so faint it could have been imagined, Rex let out a quiet, barely audible whine. John's breath hitched. It was the first sound Rex had made since that night. Slowly, carefully, John held out his hand. "It's okay, boy." Rex didn't pull away. He didn't move closer either, but for the first time, he didn't turn his back. And that was something. John knew he had to be patient. Rex wasn't the same dog who once followed his every step, who would wag his tail at the sound of his voice, who would leap into action at the slightest command. But deep down, somewhere beneath the silence, the hesitation and the fear, John believed that Rex was still in there. The night was quiet. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the faint hum of crickets filled the air. John sat on the couch, staring at the dog lying on the floor a few feet away. Rex was curled up, his breathing steady, but his eyes remained open, watching, always watching. John let out a slow sigh. "You know, I used to think we were unstoppable," he said softly. "Back then it was just us, you and me." Rex didn't move, but John continued anyway. "You remember our first chase together?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Guy ran straight into a fence, and you just sat there looking at me like that's it? That's all he's got?" Still, no reaction. John's fingers tightened against his thigh. He wasn't giving up. He pushed himself off the couch with a wince, his body still stiff from the injuries that hadn't fully healed. Slowly, he walked over to a box tucked in the corner of the room. He pulled out an old training whistle, the same one he had used since day one. For a long moment, he hesitated. What if it didn't work? What if nothing worked? But he had to try. Taking a breath, he pressed the whistle to his lips and let out a short, sharp note. The reaction was instant. Rex's ears perked up. His body stiffened. His eyes locked onto John's with an intensity that sent a shiver through him. John's heart pounded. Rex! For the first time in weeks, something shifted. The dog's muscles twitched as if caught between two forces, instinct and fear, recognition and hesitation. John crouched down, ignoring the ache in his knees. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "It's okay." Rex's nose flared, taking in the familiar scent of the man he had once trusted with his life. Then, so slowly, it felt like time had stopped. Rex took a step forward. John swallowed hard, his breath shallow. Another step, and then, just like that, Rex closed the distance. John barely had time to brace himself before Rex pressed his head into John's chest. His body trembling, a choke sound escaped John's throat. His fingers curled into Rex's thick fur, holding on as if letting go would break the moment. "You're still in there," John whispered, his voice cracking. Rex let out a low, broken whine, the kind of sound that came from deep within, the kind of sound that held every unspoken word, every moment of confusion, every ounce of pain. John shut his eyes, pressing his forehead against Rex's. "I know, buddy, I know." Rex didn't pull away. He stayed there, leaning into John, his breathing uneven but real, alive. John felt something wet against his hand and realized with a start that Rex was crying. Silent, shuddering tears, the kind that dogs weren't supposed to have. John held him tighter. "It's okay," he murmured. "You found your way back. That's all that matters." And for the first time since that night, John knew Rex was home. Days passed, and the bond between John and Rex, though fragile at first, began to solidify once more. It was a quiet, unspoken kind of recovery, a journey of moments rather than grand gestures. John kept Rex close. He took him on small walks around the neighborhood, the dog no longer walking at a distance, but staying just a little closer, his steps lighter than before. He'd sit beside John in the mornings, waiting by the door as if ready to return to the world they once knew. John would smile at the sight of him. Rex was still the same dog, the same partner, just a little more broken and a little more healed. Rex was different now, but so was John. It wasn't just the physical scars that John carried from the shooting. It was the weight of the separation, the helplessness he had felt seeing his dog turn away from him. But in the quiet hours, with Rex by his side again, John could feel that things were slowly starting to fall back into place. One morning, as the sun's first light poured through the windows, John leaned against the kitchen counter, watching Rex pacing restlessly around the room. "Ready to go out, huh?" John asked softly. His voice was hoarse from weeks of silence, from months of waiting. Rex stopped, ears pricked forward, his eyes meeting John's. Then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, he padded over to John and laid his head gently in his lap. Wave of emotion washed over John. His fingers moved over Rex's fur, gently massaging the dog's head, his heart swelling with gratitude. It was a small gesture, nothing too grand, but it meant everything. "Yeah, me too," John whispered, smiling through the sting in his eyes. The past few weeks had been a blur of quiet progress. They hadn't rushed anything, no miracles. Just a dog and his handler learning how to trust each other again. John had to remind himself constantly that Rex wasn't the same dog as before. He didn't want to force their bond to be like it was. Instead, he wanted to build something new, a connection that would be strong but gentle. And slowly, Rex began to let go of the fear. The first time Rex wagged his tail again was an event. John had been sitting on the back porch, the evening air cool against his skin, when Rex walked over, head low. Then, out of nowhere, the dog lifted his tail slightly and gave a hesitant wag. It was small, uncertain, but it was enough. John had to bite back a laugh, his chest tight. "You're still my boy," he whispered, and Rex, in his own way, agreed. But it wasn't just the tail wag. It was the way Rex would look up at John in the mornings, like he had remembered the world they shared. The way he followed John everywhere he went, just like before. The way he would rest his head on John's lap at the end of the day, as if to say, "I'm here." Everything about their bond had shifted, but it hadn't broken. The real test, however, came one afternoon when John took Rex to the park, just a small park with a few benches and trees lining the edges. It was a place they had visited countless times before. John stood still for a moment, taking in the familiar surroundings. It felt like years since they had been here together, but it also felt like no time had passed at all. The air was warm. The sound of children's laughter echoed from the swings, and the soft rustling of leaves filled the space between them. Rex was quiet at his side, just a few inches away. John could feel the weight of the dog's presence, familiar and comforting. But there was something different in the air today. John bent down and picked up a stick. He tossed it a short distance, just as he had done countless times before. Rex froze. For a moment, John's heart dropped. He had waited so long for this. He couldn't take the chance of losing it now. But then Rex's eyes flickered toward the stick, his tail giving a slight wag. The tension in his body seemed to melt away. Rex took a few hesitant steps forward, then paused. John's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Go get it, boy." And then, as if something had unlocked inside him, Rex broke into a run. His powerful legs carried him with the same grace and speed John had remembered. His tail whipped through the air, his eyes bright with the familiar fire. John's chest swelled with pride, his breath catching in his throat. Rex had done it. He had remembered. Rex grabbed the stick in his mouth and returned it to John, dropping it at his feet with a look of satisfaction. The dog's eyes shone with something John hadn't seen in so long. Pure joy. "Good boy," John whispered, crouching down to ruffle Rex's fur. The dog leaned into the touch, his body warm and solid against John's knees. For the first time in weeks, John felt like everything was going to be okay. They were back. Later that evening, as they sat together on the porch, the sky painting itself in hues of orange and purple, John looked down at Rex. The dog rested his head on John's lap, his eyes half closed in contentment. "You know," John said, his voice low, "I thought I'd never get you back." Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, a simple gesture but enough to break the silence between them. John smiled, running his fingers through the dog's fur. "You came back to me, buddy, and we're going to be all right." The world seemed still, the only sound the rhythmic breathing of the dog beside him. And for the first time in a long while, John felt peace settle over him. He wasn't just a man with scars, he was a man with a second chance. Rex shifted slightly, his eyes meeting John's. There was a bond between them that words could never capture, a bond that had weathered storms, faced the impossible, and now, with time and patience, had returned stronger than ever. John couldn't help but whisper, some things are worth fighting for." And Rex, as if he understood, gave a soft, contented sigh.